Well, it looks like it's 7 o'clock, and I want to welcome everybody this evening to the, I guess, be the fourth in our series of virtual ag meetings that we're hosting here in the Frontier District, and glad to have each and every one of you on. I know we have both Zoom, and then we have those watching on Facebook Live as well, and these will be recorded. If you'd like to go back and maybe review something later, let us know, and we can show you how to access that. But I want to welcome everybody this evening. What a beautiful day outside, and hard to believe that we were experiencing strong winter here just a week and a half or so ago. Amazing how things change. But we got an excellent program this evening that I think you'll find very informative. A couple topics that I think are very, very timely, and glad to have you with us. I want to make just a few introductions of my coworkers here before we get started. From our Garnett office, we've got coworker Ryan Schaub. From our Linden office, and we've got Rod, and I guess Rod doesn't have his camera turned on tonight, but Rod's here with us in the office. Appreciate him. And then our office professional, and the one that's in charge of marketing, and the one that each and every one of you registered with and took care of getting things organized and everything, Madison Maurer. Glad to have her on board and helping us put these on. Myself, Darren Hibden here in the Ottawa office, and glad that you could all be with us. Well, every year when it comes to crops, we get questions for farm visits, and we see odd things happening, and many times it goes back to fertility. And so we decided that that's one of the issues that we wanted to address in our virtual series was crop fertility issues. And to do that, we've got Dr. Dorivar Ruiz Diaz, fertility specialist from Kansas State University. He also oversees the soil testing lab at Kansas State, but he's got several in-depth studies out in the field looking at different things, and he's going to address a couple different topics on fertility this evening. We're glad to have Dorivar with us. Dorivar, it's all yours.
Thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen here.
While Dorivar is doing that, I might mention if anybody has a question, either type it into the chat, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, they'll be monitoring that as well. Just type that in the comments section, and we'll get those questions to our presenters.
Okay. Can you see that, Darren?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend the evening with you and talking a little bit about fertility issues. And like Darren mentioned, as we go along, if you have questions, please just put it on the chat. We'll answer those as we go along, or answer them at the end. But I think that's one of the good things about this Zoom option, is that you can keep putting those questions there. So don't hesitate to do that. You don't have to wait until the end. My name is Dorivar Diaz, soil fertility specialist. And some of the things I wanted to discuss today focus obviously on things that we are doing there in the southeast part of the state. And wanted to share some of the things we did the last couple of years, specifically on potassium and phosphorus. We'll talk more about soybean and corn primarily, of course. We also do have some work on nitrogen, specifically looking at nitrification inhibitors, timing of nitrogen application in corn, as well as work that we have actually for multiple years there in Ottawa, looking at starter fertilizers and placement of phosphorus. So we'll share some of that data, primarily the last summer, as well as 2019 data with you today. There's one project we have going on in soybeans the last 2 years. We started 19 and 20. Is focused on potassium, and obviously potassium is one of the main limiting factors in the southeast. Is where we tend to see most of the potassium limitations, and so we are doing quite a bit of work there in that area. A lot of it looking at response, but also trying to improve management and soil testing methods as well, as again, for some of those clay soils, heavy clay soils, sometimes some of the methods we are using may not be the best ones, and that's one of the challenges. This is one of the sites. This is in Parsons. This one, just to have an idea, the type of response that we're seeing there. This is a check with no P or K. You can see the deficiency basically show up there. And then we have treatments here, basically a combination of a full rate of K2O and P2O5 next to one that only has potassium. And actually you can see the difference a little bit here in terms of the additional growth and that we're seeing in season with the application of phosphorus as well. And so basically that combination of both P and K in this case. One thing that's very typical, I would say, of potassium is that we tend to see this type of differences show up pretty much the entire season. And something that's very interesting and very important actually for soybean in particular is to have some of these conditions later in the season where that soybean still stay green and continuing to basically fill the seeds. As we know, the last few weeks usually in the season is where we tend to determine most of the yields in soybean. So it is very important to keep that plant basically active as much as we can to be able to maximize yields. And this one of the examples that we tend to see later in the season from potassium. And this is a soil test K. This is in Ottawa. 101 part per million soil test P, so soil test K, so it is low, and basically call for application in this particular site. And so one thing that I wanted to also look, one thing that doing this particular study, we've been obviously focusing on potassium, but something that is very, is not uncommon to see is that you tend to also see some low phosphorus happening in combination with those low K soils. And this is one location where we have 95 part per million soil test K, and but we also have 10 part per million soil test phosphorus. So basically both low in that particular location. So we basically look at both the P and K in this particular study. And so if you can see here, this is the check, basically no potassium, no phosphorus application, 28 bushels. We apply a full rate of K. This is 150 pounds, so it's way more than the typical recommendation, but we would just want to make sure we have plenty there. And we do see an increase here in yields. We have a 6 bushel yield increase, but if you compare that to the phosphorus only, we put at 80 pounds of P2O5 here, kind of a similar yield increase, 5 bushel yield increase on top of the control. But clearly in this case, for example, something else become limiting. It is phosphorus becoming limiting, and in the opposite situation, of course, potassium becoming limiting. So that combination is we really see the maximum yield increase in this location. We almost double the yields in this case by combining both P and K. So going back to this point of looking at both P and K in combination is very important. Sometimes we tend to focus maybe only on phosphorus. We oftentimes tend to be most of the limiting factor, but we may be missing on potassium, and sometimes the opposite happen as well. So that combination is pretty important in some of our soils in the Southeast, at least from some of the locations that we're finding. And this last year we have accumulated 8 locations total, and we're going to put a few more locations this year as well. One other thing that often happens is that, okay, we do see, sometimes we didn't get soil tests in time, or we just find out about low K issues and we start to see deficiency showing in season. So we basically took that opportunity in this project and also look at what is the value, if any, of in-season rescue type application of potassium in soybeans. And so in this graph, we have a check, again, without any potassium application, and then 50 pounds of K pre-plant. Okay, so this was before planting. And then we have the similar rate, 50 pounds of potassium in season. And this was applied about V4 soybeans, which is typically the time you start to see some of that deficiency start to show up. And so basically just broadcast dry KCl at that point. And this is the yields. And you can see there's actually a good gain in yields with that in-season potassium application, and this average of 4 locations, mostly in the southeast part of the state. We did have 1 location up in the northeast as well, but most of them would be your soils there. But again, yes.
Dorivar, I have a question that came in, wanting to know what the soil type was where this experiment took place.
Yes, the one that I just showed is in Parsons, so it would be a Parsons soil, Parsons sim loam basically, and this is average of 4 locations. So we have multiple locations, like I say, mostly in the southeast. So a lot of them will be pretty heavy clay for the most part, and so very typical, I would say, of the eastern part of the state. And so again, good question. And again, just keep putting those in the chat as we go. And again, this is the pre-planned. One thing that is clear in this case is that yes, we do get some benefit from in-season application, but really the pre-plan is still the best response. So my point here, and one thing I want to emphasize, this is kind of a rescue application, situation where again, we just find out we have deficiency symptoms. What can we do about it? But the take-home message in this case is that we really want to take care of this before planting, okay? But it's not uncommon that I will get this question almost every year is, okay, we have deficiency, what can we do about it? And I think that's kind of the message in this case. But clearly, to get maximum yields, we need to be taking care of this before planting. We measure all kinds of things here on the soil size, but also plant uptake. And this is basically potassium uptake during the growing season. We measure starting V4 all the way to R6 in soybeans. And basically with the 2 rates, with the 2 treatments, either pre-plant or in season, obviously much higher uptake of potassium. But one thing that's interesting is that we do get pretty good uptake happening later in the season with that in-season application. Okay, so we are taking up, that crop is using that potassium, but at the same time, also one of the challenges that, if we're already seeing deficiency early in the season, sometimes we're really falling behind. It's really difficult to catch up during the season and compensate for yields. And I think that's what we're basically seeing here. Another similar situation, and this is something that last summer we got the chance to go and visit a field there in Osage County with Rod and Darren there, and it was really interesting. And again, not very uncommon situation. A corn, roughly this corn was about V8 when we got there, but we're seeing a potassium deficiency there. You can see some of the very nice pictures of deficiency symptoms, I guess. But the question is the same. What can we do at this point, right? And so this one situation where we're seeing that deficiency, can we do anything about it? And so we decided to put some replicated plots there and kind of follow the rest of the season and see what we find. And this is basically some pictures that I wanted to share with you. About 22 days after we broadcast apply, and this is KCL, apply, basically we put 50 pounds of K2O just as a side dress application. You can start to see a good difference there in plant growth already. 48 days after application, that difference in plant height, you can really see that in those fields, and this basically side by side with and without potassium application. Same thing really continue during the, let me see what happens here. Same thing really happens the rest of the season, 62 days. Again, much bigger plants, but still there's some deficiency symptoms show up even with that potassium application. And this is a black layer, big difference in plant height. We took many different kinds of measurements, soil and plant uptake in this, but quickly, just to show you kind of what we found there in terms of yields, we basically gain a little over 11 bushel yield increase, basically with that 50 pounds of K2O that we did side dress application. So again, connecting this again to the similar situation in soybeans, I think it is one option in these situations where we already have this problem, okay? Now still will not be basically comparable to pre-plant application, but obviously once we have a situation like this, we just wanted to do something and see if we can rescue capture some yields essentially. And so in my opinion, this is obviously you can do the numbers, 50 pounds of potassium broadcast with the price of corn and everything is definitely pay in my opinion. So we will have to consider that definitely in this kind of situation. So it was a good situation that we just took advantage of the problem that we saw there last summer. And I think we learned something from it. We maybe actually follow up on this next season as well. And so kind of a key take message basically from these projects, both on corn and soybeans, citrus application definitely contribute to some potassium uptake in yields. One of the main things is moisture, and this is always going to be a challenge. Of course, we need to get some rain to incorporate that, timely rain to incorporate and make that potassium available. And that, I think in the case that we've been doing the last couple of years, that has not been a big issue. But if we have a dry year, of course, that's going to be a big limiting factor. However, again, compared to yield response compared to pre-plant application is not the same. So definitely it's not something I will recommend. This is really, like I say, really more of a rescue type application. What can we do to maybe compensate in that kind of situation? But definitely in an ideal situation, we want to take care of this ahead of time, do all the applications pre-plan, of course. Other things that we are looking at from this project, especially from the soil test and diagnostic standpoint, we're looking at variability in season, and this is not something new. Many of you deal with this all the time. That huge variability that you see in soil test K, depending on the time when we are collecting those samples. So consistency is a key point here. And what we're finding actually is that if you are dealing with some of these soils that are really challenging and deficient in K, spring sampling tends to be better, tends to be more consistent. We do tend to have more stable numbers where we are collecting in the spring. And yes, I know logistic is a challenge when you're doing spring sampling and trying to make decisions. We want to do typically that in the fall. But again, if we're dealing with those problematic soils, I'll definitely consider doing spring sampling. A lot of that has to do with leaching of K back from the residue. And actually last fall, especially here in the soil testing lab, we saw a lot of issues, late summer, early fall was fairly dry in many regions. And so we actually saw a lot of soils that were much lower in K, in part because of the dry conditions that we didn't have basically opportunity for potassium to leach back from the residue and get back to the soil. So those are situations where we tend to see these. So if you are seeing this problem, if you collected sample last fall, maybe a little bit drier situation, keep that in mind. If you're seeing an extremely low K, that could be a factor due to the dry conditions we have last year. Of course, pay attention to the critical value, minimum of 130, and we really want to be higher than that. In our build and maintain approach, we want to get basically to the 130 to 160 range, usually to be safe and make sure we have plenty of K in those soils. Okay, so we'll switch now to nitrogen, and one of the things I wanted to touch a little bit is on timing of nitrogen, but also use of nitrification inhibitors. And before we get into that, I wanted to kind of review a little bit this typical, processes that happening in the soil when it comes to nitrogen. And, two main forms of nitrogen that we will have from fertilizer and that happens in the soil, mineral nitrogen is going to be ammonium and nitrate. And this nitrate form is really what's, potential problems for losing by leaching or denitrification. And so we want to keep most of the nitrogen in the ammonium form, right? And so if we are putting anhydrous or urea, if we put a nitrogen inhibitor, basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep that nitrogen in the ammonium form, which is immobile, which is stable, the longest we can. Basically, we want to keep that as much as we can. This process happens when we have higher soil temperature. So, nice days that today, soil temperatures start to go up, we start to see some of this process happening. Now, the other thing that is, and this is a bigger problem for the southeast part of the state, where for you guys for sure, is denitrification. We have very waterlogged conditions, water sitting in the fields for a few days, especially very high temperatures. That's where we start to see some denitrification problems. Couple of things that I want to emphasize here. What do we need to have for denitrification to happen? First, we need to have nitrate, okay, which as I mentioned earlier already. We need to have nitrate and we need to have high temperatures, okay? And this is a temperature in the soil, okay? If you monitor soil temperature, like from the mesonet, 75 degrees and higher, that's where we start to see denitrification, of course, when we have wet soils. And so when is this gonna happen more often? Typically, it's gonna be, late June, when we get to those higher soil temperatures, that's where denitrification is more problematic. And so we have a study we've been doing the last 4 years looking at NSERV nitrification inhibitor with spring anhydrous. And this is really data from Manhattan and Roseville. So it's a little bit different soils for sure, but still the principle, I think, in terms of how much benefit we're getting from these inhibitors, which is always a question. Again, this is obviously, you guys have a lot higher risk for nitrogen losses every year compared to what we'll see here in Manhattan. So keep that in mind. But out of 8 years in this study, we basically, 3 side years, we basically saw a yield benefit from the use of inhibitors with anhydrous in the spring. Other years, we didn't see anything. So you can do the numbers in this case. And this is not uncommon, even for you guys, in some of those soils that may be losing nitrogen more often. And there's going to be years where maybe you're not going to lose much nitrogen. A lot of that depends on timing of the rain and so on. But anyways, my point here is that, nitrification inhibitors always tends to be more of an insurance policy, if you will. May not see it every year, but, in this case, 3 out of 8, we're seeing a yield benefit here in Manhattan. We also have a couple categories when it comes to inhibitors. I just want to review this a little bit. One is the nitrification inhibitor, which is what I just showed you. Most usually you're gonna get more benefit from this in situations where we have leaching denitrification, situations like you guys. Then we have urease inhibitors, basically something that would be an issue only for urea and typically tends to be more of a problem in no-till systems, okay? Broadcast supply urea sitting on no-till on the surface, that's typically where we tend to see problems of volatilization and where we can see benefit from urease inhibitors. And this is important because if we are incorporating that urea, either with tillage or if we have rain, a few days after, obviously we're not gonna see the benefit of that urease inhibitor. So we have to kind of keep in mind what is the potential loss and where we can see benefit. Do we need to use a nitrification inhibitor or do we need to use a urease inhibitor for a particular situation? Obviously, nitrogen placement and source and time always going to be a key factor. So especially no-till, we need to pay special attention to that. Again, the timing and placement of that nitrogen is going to be a key. Now, in-season application of nitrogen, and there's a lot of research going on in different places looking at nitrogen timing, and a lot of this kind of goes back to this graph, and many of you have seen this before. This is basically nitrogen uptake during the growing season in corn, okay? And a few things to show here, when you get to about V8, V10, it's very steep uptake of nitrogen happening here in corn. We're talking 7+ pounds of nitrogen per acre per day that corn is taking up. So that's one point that I want to show here. The other point is that, when you get to about VT, tassel, you basically took up about 75% of the nitrogen at that point. So we still have about 25% of nitrogen that we're taking up after tassel. Okay, so that means with a lot of these new hybrids in particular, the nitrogen uptake tends to be a little bit later in the season. And so that basically opens a little bit more opportunity for in-season nitrogen application. We do have more flexibility. As long as we do have enough nitrogen, at least I would say 70% of the nitrogen before V10, then we do have basically a chance to pretty much spoon feed that nitrogen during the growing season. That also means that, you know, if we do have losses, we can go back and maybe apply an extra nitrogen. A lot of guys do that now. You know, at tassel, they may put another shot of nitrogen if they have a chance to get to in the field. That's obviously a challenge. And there's some people that have high clearance equipment or even fly urea using airplanes. Those are all things that I hear people do to apply extra nitrogen. And so this is split application of nitrogen. This is from Parsons as well. 3 years of data, 150 pounds of nitrogen pre-plant using UAN, and split application of nitrogen, a V6 and a V10. You can see average, this again, average of 3 years. You can really see the benefit here from split applying that urea and putting part of that as a side dress. And again, on top of what we are putting pre-plant. And so that's basically keeping that nitrogen safer. We are feeding that corn a little bit better, especially in those soils that we may have potential for losses. And again, these clay pen soils. Essentially what we tend to see in this, and this is the same data, what happens is that, you know, as we're getting later in the season, that corn in many cases tend to run out of nitrogen, okay? And so what, as we split applying that nitrogen, we tend to compensate and provide more nitrogen later in the season, which is what we are seeing with some of these new hybrids, which again, we see a little bit more of a delay in terms of nitrogen uptake compared to older hybrids. Okay, so split application of nitrogen, what we've seen, and we've done a lot of studies looking at multiple timings. A lot of what we've done is also applications even as late as VT at tassel. And so we do tend to see higher nitrogen use efficiency with that split application of nitrogen. So again, some of these new hybrids can really benefit from that, and that seems to be pretty consistent. Now, yield response kind of vary a little bit depending on the season. And I would say, for example, 2019, I know a lot of guys put extra nitrogen in 2019, was pretty wet. We did have some losses of nitrogen in many cases. That's, I think, an ideal situation where I think we can, you know, we know we lost some nitrogen. We can go back late, even at tassel or even slightly later than that, and still get some yield benefit. But the key here is, did we have any nitrogen losses? Are we okay in terms of our nitrogen rates to begin with? I know there was also guys in 2019, for example, in the north central part of the state, that yield potential was actually much higher than expected. So they went back also and applied a little bit more nitrogen in that kind of scenario. So those are things that will have to play, you know, year by year, essentially, in terms of whether or not we will consider extra nitrogen in season. But certainly it is a potential for rescue application of nitrogen in those hybrids. Okay, so we're getting close to time here. And the last thing I wanted to share with you is this is another study. We have actually a multi-year study in Ottawa looking at corn and soybean and phosphorus placement, in particular with strip till. And so I wanted to share with you what we saw last year, 2020. Just again, we do have multiple years, but just to show the most recent data. And I choose 3 treatments here. This is the control. This is broadcast 40 pounds of P2O5, okay? And this is broadcast plus starter fertilizer, the same rate, 40 pounds of P2O5, but split 20 and 20. So we basically put 20 broadcast and 20 with the starter fertilizer. And one thing that I wanted to show here is that, you know, we do get a benefit from putting part of that phosphorus with the starter fertilizer, and we're talking low testing phosphorus in this case. And we're also looking at lower rates of phosphorus, of course, okay? And so again, if we are thinking about lower rates of P, and if we do have low testing P, and I would say in this case, less than 10 parts per million, applying part of that phosphorus with the starter seems to consistently provide some extra benefit. Of course, we do get the benefit from the just broadcast application, but we tend to see this extra benefit with the same application rate, but split applying some of that phosphorus with the starter fertilizer. So something to keep in mind, again, especially for lower rates, and if we are dealing with low testing K, low testing P, in particular, again, that placement will be a big factor. And this is data from last year in Ottawa. And so with the starter fertilizers, in this particular study here, we basically, what we did was drivel apply, okay? But just wanted to compare here kind of the options we have. Obviously, 2x2 has been the kind of the standard over the years. We can put higher volumes of fertilizer, good response, but this drivel application basically behind the planter works pretty well also, especially if we put in high volumes. You know, even we can even put some nitrogen, UAN. If you're putting 10-30-40, we can blend that with UAN, and so that works pretty well. And obviously there's some benefits as well there. We don't need to have the 2x2 attachments, you know, bigger planters and so on. That's a little bit of a, some people don't like that very much, and I can see that. So a lot of benefit there from drivel application. A lot of guys also using furrow, of course. The main thing here is that keep in mind the rates that we can apply is much lower. So we have to be careful there, especially with corn and soybean. Tend to be much more sensitive to potential damage to from fertilizer application. And this, you've seen this before, but just want to, you know, in furrow applications, rate of application, and really what we need to be looking at here is the nitrogen and potassium. In 30-inch row spacing, we want to be below about 8 pounds of that combination to minimize any potential risk of potential damage. And this is in furrow in contact with the seed. Obviously, we're doing 2x2, or we're doing drivel on the surface. We can apply pretty much as much as we want, as long as we are not getting in any contact with the seed, essentially. And with that, I think we're right on time. I want to make sure and don't take much of the time from Terry and Sarah, but I don't know if we have any other questions at this point.
All right, if anybody's got a question for Dorivar, put that in the chat, or those of you on Facebook Live, type that into the comments, and we'll get that relayed. Also, go ahead and note Dorivar's contact information. If anybody has questions, you know, contact either Ryan, Rod, or I, and we'll get to question Dorivar and get you hooked up and get you an answer. So, well, Dorivar, I appreciate you joining us this evening and sharing the information. Very timely.